love the X-Men. It's like my favorite thing. I mean, like, I love cats, and I love the X-Men, and I love the X-Men that are cats. There's more than you'd expect. Like, there's Sabretooth, and then there's this one, Feral. And then there's also the other guy who's like skinny Sabretooth, whose name I cannot remember. It's like Feral. It's like, he's like Beastie Boy, or that's not it. Wild Child. I don't really care for Wild Child. I think he's fine. I like Cat's Eye, another cat-themed X-Men adjacent character. Point is, there's quite a few. That's not what this video is about. Point is, I love the X-Men. And now that the writer's strike is over, which, very good, Hollywood, you guys did it. You got it done. Congratulations to the writers. You guys are talking about making an X-Men movie now. By you guys, I mean Marvel, Kevin Feige, the writers that would do that. As much as I think that's great, I'm very excited about that. And I think, I'm excited to hear stories that's being pitched and people are speculating who's going to be on the team and all that stuff. I do want to make one suggestion to Kevin Feige, to whoever becomes the person in charge of this. What I kind of think should happen, this isn't a suggestion, but just in general, like, I think the X-Men should be kind of their own thing. Like, they should obviously exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because that's kind of the point, and that would be fun. But I think, like, there should be one X-Men movie a year and one X-Men show a year, and that's just it. And, like, Marvel does whatever it was doing already. That's fine. It keeps making good movies and shows and whatever. But there's just an X-Men thing and another X-Men thing every year. And then eventually that can kind of bleed over into the bigger MCU. And you can have characters that would show up in those projects, make appearances. But I guess I just want to focus on the X-Men. What I don't want is just one X-Men movie every phase. So like every 4 years we get an X-Men movie. Because I think that is very much underutilizing this fantastic team with tons of different characters and players and lots of different groups and generations. So, because I just think if we do that, we're going to be where we were in 2000, whatever it was, 2006, or 2019, where we do 3 movies in a row, and then at the very end we do a Dark Phoenix, and then because of just like the amount of time that's spent, we end up rebooting everything. We never get to do the cool stuff. This needs to be the kind of thing where we're constantly getting X-Men movies, but I do think that like it should be a priority that we're getting an X-Men movie a year. And I don't think that that is difficult at all. Like, there's so many opportunities depending on how the X-Men are introduced. But let's say, there's some sort of reboot or some sort of like universe blending thing where there are new characters in this universe played by new actors, and they're just the X-Men, and we kind of pretend they've been around the whole time. Or like maybe they started popping up in the 70s slowly. They became friends. We had some enemies, some big bads, and then in 2025 or whatever, that's when the real like groups start forming and everything becomes a big deal. Anyway, what I worry they might do is just make an X-Men movie and make that one X-Men. And that's the first one. And I understand the thought process there. It's the word X-Men. People love the X-Men. She-Hulk knows who they are. They're very popular. And you're going to want to advertise that. And you also want to tell stories about the main X-Men, right? Like either it's First Class or the second generation team, the giant size X-Men, whatever it is, like people want to see that movie. But what Marvel I'm cautioning you on is I think it would be maybe kind of cool if the X-Men movie was actually the Avengers movie of that phase, right? 3-4 movies in, 3-4 shows in, then we get a movie that is just called X-Men. And maybe it takes characters from the different movies and shows and puts them together on their own team. Or maybe it just kind of, builds upon this world that we've created about like this mutant culture, how some of these characters know each other, how they're treated by different people. And then it's like, well, you saw all these guys. Let's see what Charles Xavier's working with. And here's his, elite strike team of mutants and whatever. And I was thinking like, okay, then what do we do? What are the phases leading up to X-Men? If we're not starting with X-Men, what do we do? And I came to 2 conclusions. One, you could just make movies about individual characters, right? Storm can be a movie. Cyclops could be a movie. Beast could be a movie. Well, Beast could be a movie, sure. Beast and Iceman could be a movie, like a team up maybe or something like that. Jean Grey could be a movie. Gambit should be able to be a movie. Rogue could be a movie. There's so many potential movies in there. Colossus and Magic, like origin story in Russia with their brother and like the army and Omega Red, that would be a movie. But you could do that. That's easy. Like I said, you just name X-Men and go, that's the phase. I'll do 5 of those and then boom. But I was thinking about like, if we want to focus on other teams, if we want to make this the kind of drive of the phase is like, instead of just introducing individual X-Men, we're going to start introducing groups of X-Men. What teams should they maybe focus on before the X-Men proper are introduced in the universe. Now, there are a lot of X-Men teams in Marvel Comics. There have been many different names of teams that have shown up over time, and because of that, a lot of what those teams are has changed. Like sometimes it's kind of the same thing, but just in a different generation. A new class takes over, and then they are whatever that is called, right? And sometimes a name that maybe was attached to a villain gets taken up by a hero, so that team is very different. So I'm gonna give you 5 teams that could show up in the MCU, but I'm also not just gonna give you names of teams. I'm gonna tell you kind of what team I'm talking about and what the vibe of that movie or show would be, because I think that's very important. So first one, I think this is the obvious one, kind of. I mean, I guess this is the obvious one in terms of like, obviously we're gonna do these guys. I think it's obvious in terms of like, where the Marvel Cinematic Universe is now, especially where it is this week, these guys make all kinds of sense, is a team called the Exiles, Exiles. So they are a bunch of mutants from different universes. So we're back on the multiverse thing, but really here, it just kind of makes you say like, oh, this one from this universe that was popular in the comics, and this one, but not the one we know from the universe that's popular in the comics. Now, when this book was written, I imagine the way they kind of thought about it was they said, oh, well, actually those characters are really popular. Like that alternate universe we created has a lot of character designs and like some standout characters, but they can't come to the regular Marvel Comics universe. Or like they could, but that's a lot of work. So let's take a couple of the big players there and put them on the Exiles. And on the other hand, I think they took other characters and said, I'd love to have that character on the Exiles, but we can't really like pluck them out of the current comic run, just drop them in. So we'll say, oh, it's you from another universe. I think you could actually stick pretty close with what the actual Exiles were in the comics originally. I'd say 2 are really important, 3, but one of them is a character named Nocturne who does not exist in like you've never heard of her, because I believe she was invented for this. If she wasn't, she was not a big player. And the thing about the Exiles is they did frequently die, so they did rotate in new members. Like I think one of the original Exiles was a character named Magnus, who was like Magneto's son, and I don't even think he survived the first issue. This is kind of like the Suicide Squad of time traveling mutants. So the big 2, you got Morph. This Morph, I believe, I don't remember exactly what his deal is, but I think he's like a completely different Morph. And he is a character that can shapeshift, obviously. Like Metamorpho and Plastic Man, right? I've talked about them a lot, so I feel like you kind of know who they are. Metamorpho can change his body into anything, whatever. Plastic Man can also do that, but also he's kind of goofy, and he does it like a cartoon character would. I would say like that's the difference between Mystique and Morph. Morph will just turn into a cartoon character and do some really weird like stuff. He's got a white face that does feel like it's something that would exist in like, you know, a 90s like, you know, Freakazoid or something like that. He's a very important member of that team. I don't remember if he stayed on for the full run of the team, but he was a big part of it, and he was one of the founding members. Then you got Blink. Blink is from the Age of Apocalypse like universe, that timeline or whatever we're calling it. I guess it's like the Age of Apocalypse universe. In the MCU, you consider that a universe or a divergent timeline or whatever. But she can teleport. She's very, very, very briefly in X-Men Days of Future Past. She's the one that throws portals and stuff. Blink was very popular at the time. Those 2 characters, plus, like I said, this rotating cast. I just looked up a list of some of the ones that were kind of important. Like Mimic was one of the original team members. Like I said, Nocturne, I believe she was Nightcrawler's daughter. The Magnus kid, a Sunfire shows up, a Thunderbird shows up. But the pitch behind this team is basically this guy called the Time Broker pulls them all from other universes. Is like, hey, we've got a lot of universe problems, multiverse, all that stuff. I need you guys to go in and fix them. So this is kind of the pitch for Loki if there wasn't Loki. It's just like a TVA show, but a little bit more Legends of Tomorrow, where it's very, you're jumping to one universe in this comic, doing some silly thing, and then going to a new universe. The Time Broker is able to sub in new guys when one dies, so that's how you get these new members of the team. And after you do enough missions, you get to leave and go back to your universe if you survive. I just think it's super fun. It'd be a really easy way to introduce some of these mutant characters, and ones that I don't think people would be really like, oh man, they're already doing this guy and he's not on the X-Men. Like, I don't think anybody's going to get heartbroken about Mimic. And you can also introduce other characters. Hyperion, Captain Marvel, a version of Carol, I believe from a different timeline where she's bad, but like you get alternate universe versions of a lot of characters. And like King Hyperion, that's the story he's from, where an evil Hyperion tries to take over all this stuff. I don't know. I think if I were Marvel, we haven't seen Loki yet, like Loki season 2. I don't think it's a crazy idea to assume that after Secret Wars, or maybe right before Secret Wars, we're going to have some mutants showing up. Obviously, Deadpool's probably going to do that. I don't think it's a crazy idea to have Loki season 3 be the Exiles. Hell, like Deadpool could be the Exiles, like Deadpool 3, because Deadpool's pretty much morph, and he's got that energy. And this feels like a very good transitional team. I will say, when I saw some of these articles that they were trying to do another X-Men, it's kind of why I started thinking about this video. The second team I thought of is the team that someone had brought up on the Nando V Movies Discord, and the person is Saccharine Saboteur. How would I feel about X Factor movie as a means to introduce mutants into the wider MCU? I feel like the Xavier School format has been fairly saturated. Agree. And I think it makes sense to have the US government take first and foremost interest in the emerging mutant population, starting a sort of arms race for the most valuable assets, and ending with the lovable C and D listers we all know. The government setup could be an interesting way to contrast how different countries view the mutant diaspora outside of the US. It could be a clever way to tease Genosha, Alpha Flight, or even the Krakoa Araco. Also, thoughts on Gillian Anderson as Val Cooper. So I think Gillian Anderson could be a good Val Cooper. I do think, I mentioned this in videos before, that what they're doing with Valeria Desfontaine feels like it's Val Cooper, which is like government agent who is massing a team of superhumans, basically just like an Amanda Waller. And that's not really what the Contessa is like in the comics, but Val Cooper is kind of that, except much less evil, although definitely still like not a good guy in the traditional sense. But X Factor as a team, if you look it up, a lot of different things. It started as a place to put the original X-Men when the second group of X-Men had kind of taken over. So like the first class of X-Men, the first couple X Factor books are that. But the X Factor that we're talking about here is the, I guess, second generation of X Factor, which is the mutant team coordinated by the government that's supposed to be kind of a peacekeeping, goodwill team led by Havoc and Polaris, and the original version of the team also had Quicksilver, although he was never actually a member of the team as I remember. He just kept showing up to stuff. Multiple Man, Wolfsbane, and everyone's favorite Strong Guy. This is where he's from. Eventually, different members of this team cycled in and out. So like Forge was a big part of this team. I want to say like Random was part of the team later. The team was also, I believe, an offshoot of another team that existed that was kind of the same thing called the Freedom Force, which was Val Cooper just full out making a Suicide Squad with the evil mutants. So like Mystique, Blob, Destiny, I'm pretty sure was there. I'm going to guess Pyro and Toad, Avalanche probably. And I think you can do either of those teams, either X Factor or Freedom Force. Honestly, Freedom Force, like you lose the X branding, but that way you don't have to explain why everything in this universe is called X. Although we could call it the X gene, that just has to be established at some point. Because I just always assumed the X-Men were named after Charles Xavier. Otherwise, what a coincidence. Although I guess if the X gene is a thing, your name is Xavier, and you go like, this is the X gene. That's kind of funny. That's like my name. And then you study it, and then everybody thinks the team's named after you. But I think the idea of a government mutant force could be great. I think if we were doing this, we maybe wouldn't need to do the Thunderbolts, or we could make the Thunderbolts this and just have the Thunderbolts be made up almost exclusively of mutants. But I think you could do X Factor, Freedom Force the way they exist in that run of the comics. Just this team of government mutants trying to figure out their place in this world, trying to be both the ambassadors of mutant kind and also trying to solve general mutant problems. Like this could be a show, I think. This could be a very fun show. I guess you call it like Monster of the Week or whatever, where every week there's some new weird mutant problem going on and X Factor has to go deal with it. One of my only other problems with this group is how much it's connected to other groups and like other existing characters, right? Polaris mostly makes sense in context of being Magneto's daughter or whatever she is right now. They change it all the time. Havoc exists in context of being Cyclops, the main mutant's brother. Wolfsbane is a new mutant who kind of graduated and started doing this. So I guess that gets a little tricky. Because it's like, well, would you introduce Polaris before Magneto? It's like, maybe not. I do think there's something here, though. I think this is actually a pretty cool idea. But let's say I don't want to do that. We have other versions of this team, like the third or whatever X Factor Investigations. Probably my favorite X-Men run. It's similar team composition. Some characters stay, some kind of rotate in. The main ones, in this book, Multiple Man gets elevated into main character, and he gets really into noir and decides to become a private investigator and calls up some of his friends. So like Strong Guy is there. Wolfsbane is there, and then some other mutants come in. Siren, Monet, a weird little girl named Lila Miller who just kind of shows up and starts doing stuff, and what she ends up doing is complicated, but it more or less makes sense. And then Shatterstar is a big part of that team, especially in the original run. And then the other guys show up, Havoc makes an appearance, Polaris makes an appearance. But like the idea with these guys are, this is after the decimation, which is when Scarlet Witch made all the mutants go away. There's like this weird power shift. When so many of these mutants got depowered, then a lot of these support structures for mutants kind of crumbled. They all moved into a neighborhood, kind of like a Chinatown or Little Italy, called District X. And that's where Madrix takes up shop and decides to solve mutant-related mysteries. So if you want to do that in the MCU, say, oh, there's mutants showing up. That's something that nobody quite knows how to deal with. Oh, there's this one guy that's going to be a private detective and he's going to figure it out. And you don't even need to say that he's multiple man. Like in the first couple of episodes, he's just this guy with a couple of weird friends who seem to live with him or something. And he's really good at solving these mysteries. And also, oh, look, he's on the other side of the street too. What's going on there? Uh-oh, he just got stabbed. No, he didn't. He's over here. And then you kind of figure out over time. But you could make this like neo-noir, Blade Runner 2049 vibe. Madrix takes himself very seriously, especially in this book. There's characters that are more zany, kind of there for comedic effect, but I think there's a lot of drama in this book, and I think this book could make a lot of sense in a world where mutants are emerging. You have these figures come in, try to take advantage of them. But then you have this other mutant who decides to take it upon himself to try to solve some of these problems. I actually think this would also be a good show. See, this is the thing. All of these would be good shows because they are based off of these runs in comics that, I guess, unlike certain X-Men stories like Dark Phoenix or whatever, they're not really events. They are very serialized stories, and a lot of them are based off of these serialized kind of narratives, right? Like Exiles is kind of like Doctor Who. X Factor Investigations is like any noir thriller show. But those are three teams right there. You have the Exiles, the X Factor version 1, or at least like version 2, but the X Factor that works for the government, and then X Factor Investigations, the detective agency. If you want to do a different group, New Mutants, I don't hate New Mutants. I think there's parts of it that are pretty good, mostly the casting besides Roberto. I think like the main characters are all really good. Like I think Maisie Williams is a very solid pick for Wolfsbane. Obviously, I love Anya Taylor-Joy as Magic, one of my favorite X-Men characters, and I think like she was perfect there. And Charlie Heaton, I think, was pretty good. And Blue Hunt, who played Mirage, was also good. Like I think overall, that movie is very messy, and it's clearly been reshot, and it was like one of these movies that seemed to be very interrupted by the pandemic. So I think one of the nice things about that movie is the expectations are pretty low. Like I think if New Mutants did not exist, that movie had never happened, it would be very smart to start with a New Mutants team. So have the older mutants have happened, right? Like the first class and the second class, the giant size X-Men, they already exist. Some of them are off doing their own thing. Some of them are still at the Institute, but then the New Mutants show up. So you have Wolfsbane, Magic, Mirage, all these guys that show up in the movie basically. That would be a great entry point for mutants in the MCU and for the Xavier Institute in a way that would be fully new, because these would be new characters. However, they did that movie already, and I think it definitely is not a brand that they want to resuscitate immediately. So I would say if you want to do something like kind of like New Mutants, this is where the team Generation X could work. Generation X was kind of like New Mutants again, so I imagine this was in the 90s. I'm really cloudy on specific years comics came out, if they came out before I read them. A lot of them sandwiched together. It feels very 90s, especially if you look at it, but it also could be early 2000s, and I could be like totally wrong. But basically, this was a team led by Emma Frost and Banshee, and the thought process for this was just, hey, we got a lot of mutants here. There's more of them. They're younger. This is the new class of mutants. Let's train them. They all become friends, whatever. The members of this team are very popular characters now. And I think, well, some of them are, but I think specifically introducing a couple of them as POV characters to see the larger Marvel Cinematic Universe X-Men is pretty smart. Jubilee is the main character in the original Generation X series. She would be perfect here as like a young character kids are supposed to relate to, even though she was created as the ultimate 90s kid, but like we can kind of recontextualize her for the 2020s. Geez, that is a crazy thing to say, 2020s, but yeah, it's 2020. So you would recontextualize her for like 2020 or 2025 or whenever this comes out as like a youth, a Gen Z. And then you have some of the other characters that everybody likes from that team. Monet from X Factor Investigations is where she gets her start. Penance, another character that's complicated but tied to Monet. Chamber, everybody loves Chamber. This is where he starts. Skin, I believe this is where Darwin shows up. This would be a very good opportunity to show the Xavier Institute without showing all of the characters we already know. Also, this team is much more diverse, and also this team is very young. So we can cast younger actors, and these can be the stars that age with the franchise. And this is something that I think this is really important here. I don't think the X-Men movie can all be adults. The same way that like the Avengers were all adults when they started doing Avenger stuff. Like I do think part of the fun of X-Men and the fun of the original movies to some extent, although they, besides Rogue, they never really got these, but the comics for sure and the cartoons is a lot of it the idea that like these special children that no one understands have this special power and they have to go live in the fancy school. And like it very much connects with any kid pretty much who is not perfectly fitting in. And that is everybody pretty much. But like that element of like, hey, this kid on screen is just like you. Obviously, they have superpowers, but besides that, see yourself in their shoes, understand the world of the X-Men through their eyes, and buy all of their clothes and merchandise and stuff. Like, that makes sense as just in general a good storytelling vehicle, but also it's a good way to get kids interested in the X-Men. Because kids should be interested in the X-Men. It is a very fun concept for kids. This team is led by Banshee and Emma Frost, two other characters that have not been overexposed in universe. So, like, we could create this kind of foundational team in Generation X, which we'd call it. People would think they're copying Gen V, but Gen V is really copying Generation X, and both of them are just named Generation and then letter that's associated with the superheroes in that universe. And like, that's not, they didn't invent the idea of calling it Generation X. They called it that in the comics because that already existed. And I don't think you could call it Gen Z, but there's also a second Generation X led by Jubilee and Chamber. I don't think those characters like need to be introduced immediately. I think we can take a little bit more time with them. However, there are characters in there like Quentin Quire who people really like, and I would like to see on screen kind of soon. But I think Quentin Quire could play a lot of other roles. So those are four: the Exiles, X Factor, Government Team, X Factor Investigations, Generation X. I'll say honorable mentions. I think you could make these movies without them even being in the X-Men, like the way I say like one X-Men movie and one show a year. I don't even think these would need to count, but I think they should make an Alpha Flight thing and they should make a Starjammers thing. The Alpha Flight team is the Canadian, mutant adjacent team. They've always been associated with the X-Men. However, not every member of that team is a mutant. In fact, I want to say a majority of them are. Well, I don't know. I guess it's a rotating group as well. But you've got characters like Sasquatch, who I believe is connected to the Hulk. Like, I think he's a Gamma guy. You've got Snowbird, the snow goddess character. You've got Shaman, who is just a magical character. But then you have the two French twins, the super speed ones, and they're mutants. Puck, I think, is a mutant. He must be. And then like Wolverine sometimes has history with this team. The Starjammers are just the Guardians of the Galaxy again, but one of them is Cyclops' dad. Honestly, don't think we need a Starjammers thing. I think those characters are fun. And like there's other groups like the Shi'ar that they can interact with that would be something new. And the Guardians of the Galaxy were there second. Like the Starjammers existed before like what is the contemporary Guardians of the Galaxy did in the comics, but in the movies we already have them. We have a team of aliens led by a plucky Flash Gordon type guy who is cool Han Solo, whatever. That's what the Starjammers are. I would say the other team you could do an X-Men thing of in the MCU is the Morlocks. One of the fun things about the Morlocks is it is this extreme example of how mutants are treated. So if you want to set a very clear standard originally for like the mutants are hated and feared in society for these reasons, right? Because if you start with X-Men, you can show them like they do in the movies, people like, mutants, get out of here. You can't be in my bar. But like sometimes it feels like All right. Well, it's not great for mutants. Definitely, they have a lot of problems, and like a lot of supervillains want to exterminate all of them. Like the X1 movie, like when someone sees Scott Summers come into that train station wearing his red glasses, they'd be like, "That's a mutant. Get that guy out of here." Right? Like sometimes they're treated like that, and I think if you really want to lean hard into that out of the gate, the Marauders are a great story. Like their history is a little complicated because Dark Beast, a character that is not worth explaining. Well, all right, he's Beast from another universe who's evil, but he creates them. But you could just say like Callisto and Caliban form this group of mutants that live in the sewer with Marrow and Spike, character from the animated series. He's one of those. The other thing that's interesting about the Morlocks is this is one of the teams that some famous mutants had been on. Specifically, Storm was a Morlock for a while. She led the Morlocks and very famously beat Callisto in combat to become the leader of the Morlocks. And you could do this, like you could start thinking about all of these teams and saying like, okay, which single X-Men are we gonna put on this team, right? Like we could put Thunderbird on the Exiles and he could be a main character who lives and then goes to the X-Men like he does in the Giant Size X-Men book. You can have Storm be a Morlock and then have her transported into the X-Men for the big X-Men movie. Like if you want to treat it like the Avengers, you can do each of these movies and shows introducing a different team of mutants, showing a different mutant corner of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then take one character from each thing and put them in the X-Men. Jubilee from Generation X and Emma from Generation X. Now they are main characters in the X-Men. And Banshee, he would be a main character. I think those 5 teams for me are the teams that stand out right off the bat. Is like those are smart places for them to start because those are familiar tropes that we haven't seen done to death in the X-Men universe. None of those characters that I've mentioned, I think, have been in more than 1 or 2 movies, and very rarely do they get speaking parts, right? Like Caliban had a big part in Logan and, you know, a couple lines in X-Men Apocalypse, but like a lot of these characters are the X-Men characters that, because these movies tend to focus on the core X-Men and like kind of expand a little bit, we never get to see these guys, but they are fun and they have a lot of personality. There's a lot of stories that are new. And I think that's what one of the things the audiences want most right now. They want to see new characters in this world doing new things. And I think after a while, they'll be like, well, let's do the Xavier School though. But I think we have some time in the beginning, maybe set up some solo, stories. I mean, like Nightcrawler would be a good Morlock if you wanted to throw him in there. Because I think Storm could be a Morlock, but I also think the Morlocks are like an American thing. And the way Storm works on the X-Men is she is recruited by Xavier. And when he gets her, she's currently like an African goddess, basically. So I kind of like that. Like I like her coming from there. She goes into Morlocks after that. So I think like you could have a character like Nightcrawler who is Morlock adjacent, right? Like he's blue and everyone's scared of him. They chase him out of his village in Germany, have him join the Morlocks in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then later joins the X-Men. Yeah, and who would be on X Factor? I mean, Forge, I guess, maybe would be the X Factor character that you carry over. Because I would want to create a team of X-Men from these groups that is familiar, like characters that I would consider A and B listers. And no offense to Strong Guy and even Multiple Man, they're not really A or B listers. If you're considering the A list is the 10 most famous mutants and the B list is the 10 under that, right? Like Emma Frost, Storm, Nightcrawler, Thunderbird, kind of. I mean, he kind of gets grandfathered in because he was one of the really early characters. But yeah, so those are 5 mutant X-Men adjacent teams that I think the Marvel Cinematic Universe should introduce before the X-Men. Let me know in the comments if you have other favorite X-Men teams or other characters that you could put onto those teams that I mentioned. Like you could basically do Generation X and just put the New Mutants on there and just be like, listen, we all know we're not calling it New Mutants, but like that's what this is because those characters are all great. I don't see why there wouldn't be some sort of leak, because that's what happens constantly, of like a couple of teams that they're thinking about establishing, or at least a couple of storylines that they're thinking about establishing. And then if we know they're doing that, then we go, oh, okay, so that's these guys are going to be involved in that storyline. Let's say this. The only one I love that I don't think quite works yet is Excalibur. Only because I think you could do Captain Britain for sure. I just don't love the idea of introducing Nightcrawler and Shadowcat as members of Excalibur before they're X-Men. That makes sense for them as a move after they're X-Men. But before they're X-Men, it's like, why are they here? Neither of them are British. They don't seem to know any of these people. Like, I think you could maybe get away with doing Psylocke as Betsy. So just Betsy, as I think is probably what you want to call her. Have her be the mutant representative on Excalibur, and then have Megan and Captain Britain. And yeah, obviously it's way too early to introduce Rachel. So I would love Excalibur. They're another one of my favorite teams, but I just don't think you can do them before you do the X-Men. Unless you really change it and have it be just the British superheroes and don't really involve the mutants, which is fine. I think that makes enough sense. But at that point, just make the Captain Britain movie. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you for watching. I can't wait to see what we get. And like, subscribe. Mostly Nitpicking is my podcast, all that stuff. I'll see you guys soon.